to welcome Dave back and Chris back. It's good to see both you guys on here. Topics today, and I don't know if we've covered any of these previously, and if we have, please tell me, and we would move on. One is traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu is the whole art. Sort of a positive statement. Do you have a copy of the outline?
I'm moving to it right now, Sensei.
Oh, okay. Second topic is all martial arts, do and jitsu have strengths and weaknesses, which is hard for many martial artists to admit. And teaching techniques versus developing self-defense skills. Those are three, and then I think we did that one. Maybe we'll also deal with what is randori. Since Seki rarely, if ever, let us do that. With him, it was too many injuries. And people
definitely ups the odds of injuries, that's for sure.
Yes. Okay, let's try traditional. Are you with us now, Ken? Still no audio, Ken. No audio. Wish we knew sign language.
You could type.
Yeah. My daughter learned that in high school as her foreign language requirement. It's amazing, I guess it's kind of universal regardless. Okay, let's get back to reality here. Okay. First topic is traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu is the whole art. This is a statement. Whether you agree or not is something we'll talk about. And other arts such as Aikido, Judo, Krav Maga. Title is blurry, Ken. So I'd say right on the screen, but your camera is too small to really do that. But in any event, it is. I mean, how do we interpret that? I mean, is jiu-jitsu the whole art, or since judo, aikido, some styles of karate evolved from jiu-jitsu. Hapkido is similar to jiu-jitsu, although it's a bit more on the offensive side as well. I know Krav Maga works very well with traditional jiu-jitsu. Some karate styles work very well with traditional jiu-jitsu. So maybe the question is, why don't they all just study jiu-jitsu?
Sensei, when people ask, I'll jump in and say that Hapkido is the Korean version of jiu-jitsu, and Kung Fu is the Chinese version of jiu-jitsu.
Yes.
And I have to be open about this. One of my favorite jiu-jitsu books is not a jiu-jitsu book, it's Hapkido. It's a really thick volume, hardback, and I have used that for reference many times. You and I come from schools where one of the mainstays and claims is it's all jiu-jitsu. So we kind of refer to jiu-jitsu by itself, but also collectively as whatever we learn seems to have a home in our parent martial art.
Yeah, that seems to be the issue and I know, just from what I've read and studies that, for example, Kano took elements from Jujitsu to make Kodokan Judo, because he wanted to have a safe educational activity for students. And
I think he just because he got tired of getting beat up every time he went down to class.
well, that can be too. I mean, I've walked home I've gone home certain nights from jiu-jitsu saying this is ridiculous. Uh, Especially when a 10-year-old dislocates your shoulder and then your sensei spends the next 3 months chewing you out for that.
Or you spend 3 days walking around Disney World on crutches.
Oh, no. But anyway, but seriously, I mean, is jiu-jitsu the whole art, or are we misleading ourselves? Or I know I've lost a lot of students because they say one of their first questions says, how long will it take me to get to black belt? Which is a question you should never ask your sensei as a new student. And I'll say 3 to 5 years, 6 years maybe. And I guess the concept is it's too long. But the problem is jiu-jitsu, if it's being taught properly, there's a lot more to learn there than there is in most other martial arts. And then there's the other issue that the human body can only be moved in so many different ways. So does jiu-jitsu have all the ways? If you're a skilled jiu-jitsuka, do you know all the ways to move the human body? Or are there breakdowns in jiu-jitsu where there are different emphases? Aikijitsu, trying to think of other, there's Hakurajitsu, there's, I can't think of his name now. He was, I mean, there are three or four distinct, quote unquote, versions of specialized jiu-jitsu. Then you've got jiu-jitsu.
Sensei, one thing that seems to be common, and I don't know the percentages, but first of all, to claim it's all jiu-jitsu sounds a little bit arrogant, and one-sided and self-serving. That said, a great many people that study jiu-jitsu come from other backgrounds. I had a karate background, and what brought me to jiu-jitsu was simply the realization that with my karate background, using it, I was going to rely primarily on strikes, and which can equal lawsuits very easily. And I was drawn to jiu-jitsu from the standpoint of what you and I have discussed, and that's the ability to modulate a technique to fit circumstances. And that was my initial interest. And so coming to jiu-jitsu, already had the notion of what it was going to take to rise through the ranks, but rank wasn't the interest. The interest was how much can I learn? And it's a lot of that self-determined. How much time and effort am I willing to put in?
Right.
So, someone who looks at 3 to 5 or 6 years and they're looking in terms of time, missing the boat completely. The idea is to learn what you can, compress time frames if you're able and willing. But when you come to jiu-jitsu and you already have a background in any number of other martial arts, you're really coming home to the parent martial art. And you realize that pretty early on. And the other thing is, even though you come home to the parent martial art, it was fascinating to go ahead and read up on and visit other dojos and experience the focus. for example, when I visited an Aikido dojo at the invitation of a brown belt in that dojo, the head sensei took offense for me being there, even though I wore a white belt and sat in the outside. I never stepped on the mat. I made it clear I was invited. I didn't just show up out of the blue. And what I observed, I thought was fascinating, is how defensive. I didn't realize how defensive Aikido is as a martial art. So got to experience firsthand the notion of somebody running at you rather quickly, and then you coming up and using their momentum against them. So Kazushi is a dominant player in that realm. So looking at the other martial arts after having become immersed in jiu-jitsu reinforces a lot of the tenets that are a part of jiu-jitsu. And I find them very nourishing in my learning processes. So the fact that you're coming home to the parent martial art doesn't mean that, oh boy, now I'm where I belong. No, I haven't explored Muay Thai sufficiently, and on and on.
Hey, anybody else want to get 2 cents in on this? Well, we don't use pennies anymore, so it's nickels or dimes.
Well, I'll do a sound check. Can you guys hear me now?
It's a little muffled, but we can hear you.
Oh, muffled. Okay, I am on a headset.
At least to my ears.
Okay. So what I'll do shortly is I'll go off of this headset. I'll disconnect. But yeah, Dave, I totally agree with you there on Dave's points. The interesting thing about all of this conversation is there are so many different fighting styles today. People are still asking the questions, which is best. There is no best other than what works best for the individual. Dave is right. How long does it take to get to black belt? Well, that depends on your commitment and your application to study and practice. And for years, my first black belt was in judo, but then I found I went off to pursue jujitsu because there were pieces of combat and martial arts study that were missing, striking and other techniques that were missing from judo. And I chose jujitsu to get the full rounded, the complete combat martial art style. So I think it depends a lot on what the individual is looking for in their martial art. I'm coming back to judo now because of certain programming that I want to do. But if there's one principle that I appreciate from the Japanese martial art, it's also that of sabaki, body movement, body control, controlling your space, but then intercepting and controlling the space of your opponent. I very much like the principle of sabaki. And I'm going to try and fix my audio problem here.
Yeah, I think part of the, like I said a little earlier, one of the things I've learned in the last several years is, I've come to accept there are only certain ways that you can, the body will move in certain ways only. And you can move the human body only in certain ways. And once you understand that concept, there are only certain techniques you can use to get the body to move the way you want to move it. And it doesn't really matter what you call the art if you have the understanding of how the body moves and how you can move it. And many times on the one hand, you can say there are only so many ways you can move the human body, but there may be several ways to move any part of the human body. And maybe the distinction between the martial arts is, which Jiu-Jitsu probably may take a more holistic view of and say, yes, we can do this. Yes, we can do that. Yes, we can do, we've got you want to hit me? Fine. There are 20 different things I can do. Whereas in some martial arts, they may say, well, if you're going to hit me, there are 5 or 6 things I can do. And that perhaps is what leads to the confusion or frustration, or causes different arts or different versions of the art. I still can't think of Ken Penland's version of jiu-jitsu. I can't think of it. It's rough on joints. It really is. When he used to do seminars with us at summer camps, in a day, he'd be on the mat for maybe an hour or two, and that's where our injuries would be. Because the other side of the coin was, he would say, well, they should have tapped out sooner, or said mate. And, so that's another whole issue. But there are some jiu-jitsu styles that are very artistic. I don't think Budoshin is, although I've seen some of my students in past years make it very artistic, just for the fun of it, because it looks better. I've seen at the other extreme, I think I've seen with Katsugo from Hal Brocious, you look at it and say, how does this stuff work? But it does, and it's not graceful at all. I mean, learning how to rip lips properly or cheeks is not a pleasant, even the learning experience. You want to put on your plastic gloves to practice that. And you can't really do it because no human is going to put up with that kind of physical abuse. So, kind of like maybe the question is, where do we draw the line of what is jujitsu and what is other arts, or assuming that jujitsu is your generic cover it all, maybe not as much in detail or artsy, but is there a way of classifying the martial arts or separating? Chris, you got to start saying something. You're listening to
Where to start, Sensei?
Those I can tell that the eyes are telling me there's a lot going on behind them.
Yeah, it's I've shared my thoughts on this before.
I know.
From my perspective, I think the conversation needs to be different, when it comes to different kinds of martial arts. Because when you go back in history, the concept of what we have now, you can call it this, you can call it that, then within that you have the subsets. So you have your rus, you have your cons, and everything else in between, and people make up stuff too over time. Those things didn't exist in the past, so in the past, martial arts was more like a Swiss Army knife. You had to know different aspects of combat. You had to know weapons and different kinds of weapons. When horses were being used, horse riding, spear techniques, and hand-to-hand stuff if you lost use of your weapon or whatever the case is, some healing aspects of it, So martial arts was always a Swiss Army knife. I think the problem we have now with the different name and terminology really came about during more prolonged peaceful times. And because what happens is, people start teaching it more on a civilian, type of a level. And then in those early days, it would be, it wasn't so much, it would be like Budo or Bujitsu from a Japanese terminology, martial arts, but then you would reference the teacher's name. So you're studying with this teacher. So then it becomes, Motoboru, or whatever. And it was always associated with the name of the teacher because every teacher was emphasizing one aspect of it. They had a different way to apply the same type of things. So there's three layers, right? There's the science of it, then there's the art, and then there's the philosophy. So the science is common in all martial arts, any martial arts that survive anywhere in the world,
Right.
and then you have the art, and the art is now about the teacher, because it's like, okay, we're going to make t-shirts, and we make, it's like the Henry Ford thing. You can have any color you want as long as it's black. That's what he was famous for, right? When he started making the Model Ts. So then somebody else comes along and says, I think I want red. So they paint it in red. Somebody else, paints it gray. And that's what started happening with the art portion of it, with the different teachers. And then so the art became associated with the name of the teacher. And then you have the philosophy, layer, and the philosophy is how you apply it. So are you going to apply it in warfare? Are you going to apply it in self-defense? Are you going to apply it for health and wellness? Are you going to apply it for competition? And now that determines how you practice, the system, because your training has to reflect your eventual goal, your outcome. So this is where the segmentation happens even more, in history. So you go from being a Swiss Army knife to being more of a razor blade, because it makes sense. You're going into a specific arena, and you see military do this too. That's why they have specialized units, right? Everybody gets kind of the same core training, and you have, specialized units. So, and as the sport starts, becoming more popular and more peaceful modern times, then the training shapes to reflect that. And if the competition is about tapping somebody out, well, then majority of your training becomes associated with that end goal. But that's a very specific niche area from that entirety of the Swiss Army knife. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, what happens over time is the name. So if more jujitsu teachers did that, okay, then jujitsu becomes associated more with grappling. If the karate people, focus on point sparring, then their art all of a sudden is associated with kicking and punching. And then the knowledge of jiu-jitsu had strikes and weapons and karate had grappling is almost lost over time, because you're seeing the razor blade versions, the very focused versions, because people are applying it very, very differently. If you get rid of sports and go back to self-defense, and I guarantee you'll see an entirely different jiu-jitsu and an entirely different karate, because you have to. Your training has to change to reflect, your end goal. So I don't get hung up on, what is jiu-jitsu, what is karate and stuff. The questions I ask is, what is the focus of the dojo? What is their philosophy? What is the philosophy of the teacher? Is the end goal of that dojo to enter their students in competition? Because see, judo is clear cut. In judo, you cannot get promoted unless you compete, after certain levels. That all of judo is like that. They never advertise it as anything different. But jujitsu or karate or anything else like that, it is not, unless you're part of a specific organization that focuses on that. You could, I mean, I have classes I call karate. You come in and you'll swear it's a jujitsu class. So because it's the focus of the class, right? And then you have other things like Aikido that are at the other end and say zero competition. You will not find an Aikido school that competes, at least not nowadays. A few years ago, there was an organization, Tomiki Aikido. They started competing a little bit, but so that's what it is. So first you have to define what is, what is Sensei Kirby's Jiu-Jitsu? Well, you call it Budoshin, but I'm just going to say Kirby's Jiu-Jitsu. Okay. Or you can say, it's not my Jiu-Jitsu, it's Seki's, Jiu-Jitsu. Whatever the case is what is your philosophy in teaching? What is your end goal in teaching? What was your teacher's end goal in teaching? And and that's to me a more clear, kind of a thing. And if you have a group of dojos that are affiliated and you try to standardize the curriculum and the philosophy, then I can say if I go into a Budoshin Jiu-Jitsu school, I expect to have the same experience with the same end goal if I go to Santa Clarita versus Burbank versus Florida or wherever else. But that's associated with the philosophy and the end goal. And the art is just how you apply it. Some systems don't allow any room for creativity for the teacher to apply it in different ways. And other schools are, other organizations are very open. And so you may see something that looks different, but it's really the same thing applied a different way. But if you see it enough times consistently, you give it a name because it's different. Now you put a new label on that, and lo and behold, you have a new system of jiu-jitsu. It's not. It's the same old thing. It's just you made it into a different razor blade, rather than a Swiss Army knife. So I don't want to get too long-winded, but for me, there's the personal part of it, and then there's the business side of it. From a personal part, I don't put a label on anything. To me, I like the Swiss Army approach because I get bored easily and I like to explore and be creative. So I want to practice any way I want. Some days I want to practice with weapons, I'll do that. Other days I want to do more grappling, I'll do that. Kicking and punching, I'll do that. I don't want to niche myself, for that purpose. But that's me. That's my personality. From a business perspective, and you can look it up. You can use AI or the old Google search or whatever. The number one recognized name in martial arts worldwide is still karate. Okay. Number two, there's a couple of, it's like Taekwondo, Kung Fu, and Jiu-Jitsu is like, the third one. So if you want mass market appeal, right, which name you're going to use? And that's why you have people calling it one thing and doing something else in the background, because the business part messes that up. It almost necessitates that because you don't want to exclude that. So in a way, I appreciate the judos and the Brazilian jiu-jitsus because that's what they call their stuff, and they don't do anything else. You're in it to train, to compete, to win competitions. It's pretty clear cut. So if I go to one of those schools, I know what I'm getting into, right away. Everything else, I mean, Hapkido, I'm, neck deep in Hapkido for many years. And I can tell you that's probably the most diverse, martial art, that I've experienced. Everybody does it completely differently because although its roots were from Daito Reiki Jiu-Jitsu, although half the Koreans will deny that, but that is the roots. They did change it, and when I say there were many different people that changed it in many different ways, and added a bunch of stuff to it or whatever. And so now you have, if you go into a Hapkido school, I can almost guarantee you no two schools will be practicing the same way. So some of them even have no understanding of the Aiki part of it. It's like Taekwondo or karate with some grappling, mixed in there, which kind of loses the whole concept. All right, I'll stop there. It looks like Ken may have some comments also.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yes, okay, thank you. So, yeah, again, I agree with Chris, but Chris interested three very important words that speak to this question of what style or what are we. Chris used the words art, culture, and philosophy. And I would add to that the spirit in which we teach, and probably even the tradition in which we teach. I like teaching a traditional Japanese jujitsu, all encompassing. And because we observe a lot of the tradition, we are actually eligible for a arts and culture grant here in the city. And I'm currently in the application process. So that's part of the art and culture of the martial art. But also here we talk about styles. If you can see this here, this sabaki, does that come across clearly? Sabaki?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
I know
sabaki.
who that is, in fact.
Oh, cool. Well, that's sabaki. That's karate in the inner circle. When I compare this to Higashi-san's, this is Kokushi Ryu Jujitsu. Both of these books, this karate book and this jujitsu book, have very similar principles because they're both talking about sabaki, or body positioning in the inner circle in combat. And I always like to make reference to this little gem, which I have here by a guy named Kirby. I still like using that and referring my students to that. But the thing is about all of this here is, yes, Hapkido is a complete fighting style. I like Hapkido. And our jujitsu, our Kenryu jujitsu, is very much like that. It's very much like the Kokushi Ryu. It's all encompassing. You can pretty much do anything in it. But to come back to what Chris said, art, culture, philosophy, and the spirit in which we practice and tradition. We are a complete fighting style in this Japanese tradition of a complete martial art, a complete fighting style. So, and otherwise, Chris, I very much like what you had to say and very much agree with your assessment of that situation.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I mean, the underlying layer, again, it's science, so my three things are, science, art, and then philosophy. So the culture part to me is within the art part of it, because your culture influences your art, right? Japanese have kind of a distinct way of doing things. Koreans have a different way. In the US, we have, different ways, of doing things. So yeah, it's difficult when you're doing the Swiss Army thing because people, a lot of people, some people don't care, but a lot of people want the competitions. They want to win things. So I can tell you in our dojo, I'm upfront with that right away. Sometimes we dabble in competition for fun, but it's not a competition school. And the reason, it's not because I don't enjoy it. The reason for that is because there's a gazillion other sports activities all focused on competition and winning a game. I just don't want to be another one. People have so many options to experience those kinds of things. But what's more rare and what's more needed and missing, is this more Swiss Army knife where they're getting more than just the physical benefit. The mental benefit, the discipline, the focus, the respect, and the variety of things, that are more suitable to daily life. And so I don't compete with the other stuff. I'm just, this is my focus here. So you can call it, Chris Karate, Chris Jiu-Jitsu, whatever it is, and I leave everything else differently. So whether it's a parent or an adult, if they're looking to, compete, I just usually refer them to another school that I know focuses on that and is really good with that. But it's a personal choice.
Okay, I think one key word here is there seems to be a consistent use of jujitsu is a complete art, even considering as ambiguous as the term is, since it can be interpreted in so many different ways. I know with Seki, there are many times he would do what was called empty hand techniques. And if you know Budoshin, you know what empty hand means. But there are styles of jujitsu that have no understanding at all of what's an empty hand technique, which is not doing something with it, which is not empty hand, which is the first thing that messes people up, because you've got something. It's what do you have in your hand, and it's just it's essentially whatever you have in your hand is an extension of your body. So, although we can say it's a complete art, and there's art, science, and philosophy there, as Chris has said, each of these is also open to different interpretations. And that's what makes it interesting. There were times when I would go into my dojo and a student would say, "Can we do something for a rear hair grab today?" I'll say, "Sure." And so that's what I teach that day. Or I may say, "Today I'd like to work on nerve techniques." Because when I was a teacher, school teacher, I'd have teachers talk to me and say, "How come you never get in trouble for putting your hands on kids and breaking up fights or with adults?" And my response is, "I don't leave any marks." And that kind of sets them back a bit, but it's an accurate statement. But that's a whole different concept to using nerve techniques, because there's so many systems, even in jiu-jitsu, that say in order for a nerve technique to be effective, it must be a strike or a hit to a nerve center. Yes, those will work. I'm not going to argue that. But those leave marks. And same thing with karate. It leaves marks. And that's what gets you in trouble. If you don't leave any evidence, it's hard to prove. It's almost like being called a ninja. Because theoretically, if you're a ninja, you don't leave any evidence of you being there. And just a quick little stupid story. Decades ago, we used to do, when the Japanese had their little Tokyo, they'd have their annual New Year celebration. They would actually invite us down to do a demonstration because they couldn't find a Japanese group to do jujitsu. And one year we were in their newly completed mall, and there's this little old lady sitting in the front row by the mat, and she noticed some other martial artists for another demo coming in, and they would like roll along the floor to go from one door to the next for the businesses. And she says, "What are they doing?" And I said, "They're ninja," because they had the ninja outfits on, the whole 9 yards. I said, "They're ninja. They're sneaking in." And she looked at me and she said, "They're not doing a very good job, are they?" So, it's there. To me, there has to be a reality check with the martial arts. And you have to, one of the nice things about jiu-jitsu is that it can always relate to reality. You can say, this is what you can do in the dojo. This is how far you can go. Out on the street, this is what's going to happen. And those students who've had, I don't want to say students should go out and find a fight, but personal experience, I think, in any martial art is the best teacher there is. Assuming you don't get in trouble for what you did. You were properly defending yourself. It's within the philosophy. You're not the aggressor. All these other things come into play. And I know when I taught junior high, and I'd have a kid who actually ended up using it on the street, and they came back to class. That experience for the whole class was an eye-opener, because they realized, hey, number one, this kid had to, broke someone's wrist to protect themselves from a knife attack. B, they did not get in trouble. C, they're upset with what they did because they injured another person, which is the last thing you want to do as a martial artist. And, you know, so you've got all these things that come into play, and for other students to experience that is a very worthwhile experience, even though it's not a personal one. And, you know, I'm not encouraging people to go out and defend themselves, but it gives you a different perspective of the martial arts as a means of self-defense. And I think that's maybe what makes a difference between competition and a martial art that's taught for, well, that's taught for self-defense. Because there are styles of jiu-jitsu that are not competitive. They simply teach the art. They're beautiful to watch. But that doesn't mean what they're doing works. And
Yeah, when you think about it, you know, in the case of jiu-jitsu, not very many people kind of knew what jiu-jitsu was in relation to the more, you know, the taekwondos and the karates and stuff like that. So when Brazilian jiu-jitsu came along, to me, it kind of saved it in a way by popularizing the name jiu-jitsu. But at the same time, like when all sports come along, it hurt it because now the term jiu-jitsu is associated with ground fighting.
right. And they
So,
don't, right.
yeah, it's the same thing happened with karate. Same thing happened with, you know, other type of martial arts.
Yeah.
So there is some level of symbiotic relationship because sports just spreads much quicker than anything else, you know. And so it's kind of nice to have that because it does the advertising for you. But on the other hand, it puts it in a niche that you don't want to be in, you know, and that's the problem. So the question is, when somebody says, you know, who talks about jujitsu, the question I would have is, how do you define that? And I can tell you 9 out of 10 times they're going to say groundwork. I say, well, that's wrestling. You know, what's the difference between if you're just going to focus? So then there's the education part, right? Is that's one aspect of jiu-jitsu, but there's a lot more. Well, where do I find these other types of jiu-jitsu school? And that's the problem because exactly, you know, where, right? How many more complete. I don't want to say traditional because that's a cultural aspect, but how many more complete jiu-jitsu places are there in relation to Brazilian jiu-jitsu places? And how does the average person even distinguish the two just from on the name alone, you know?
Yeah.
I will get inquiries probably 1 or 2 a month that where can I find a traditional jiu-jitsu dojo?
Hmm.
And my response will be, try the YMCAs, try the parks departments, because people that are teaching traditional, I think any traditional martial art, are probably not doing it for a living. They're doing it because they enjoy teaching it. They enjoy spreading the art. And that surprises a lot of people because, you know, they think there should be jiu-jitsu schools like karate schools and Brazilian jiu-jitsu schools. And I mean, it's something that, you know, it's a different concept when you're looking at traditional or more traditional oriented martial arts, where we are teaching, you know, we're teaching self-defense, we're teaching an art, we're trying to develop self-confidence, we're trying to have them build a philosophy that's morally correct. We're trying to get them to the point where they can defend themselves regardless of what art they're using or learning. And for it to be said, well, oh, just go to your recreation center or YMCA, and they kind of respond like, you know, well, shouldn't they be having their own dojo someplace? And then my response is, well, they're not relying on it to make a living.
Yeah.
Ken, jump in here. I got a comment after you, Ken. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, Dave, I want to hear from you first, please, sir. You go.
No. You got that up on the screen. I want to hear what you got.
Dave already knows he's going to counter me.
No. I don't know that. That's
Okay. Anyway, but it's interesting that we're talking about forms and what are we. So, as I say, my first black belt was in judo. And when I was president of the Abbotsford Judo Club, we managed to triple our membership and become very popular, one of the largest judo clubs in Canada and therefore also in North America. The interesting thing was a lot of guys would say to me, because I was president, we were promoting, we were growing our membership, and we did so successfully. But people would say, yeah, but the thing with judo, oh, there's no striking and there's no this and there's no that. And it's true, like there were a number of things that we did not have, that we did not promote in judo, the striking, etc. And there are people who want to do that. So 40 years ago, we were still calling our judo a traditional martial art sport. But now today, like our Abbotsford Judo Club is a competitive track judo club. They're about competition. The martial art piece of it is gone by the wayside. It's their focus is sport and tournament judo. And of course, the term judo means gentle way. However, when the term jujitsu was coined several hundred years ago, it was gentle. Yeah. Jujitsu was, yeah. I mean, it was gentle art. And the intention was, how can we practice this art in such a way that we can practice the art? But if we wish to make the tactics and the techniques hurtful or disabling, we can. But otherwise, it's gentle art. But then people got carried away with it. People said, I'm a master of jiu-jitsu now. I'm going to break your arm. And they did that. Today in judo, we get a lot of complaints in the judo community that judo doesn't have the fluidity. And in fact, it has a very much narrower scope of practice. And I sometimes jokingly call it pawa furudo, which means powerful way, because it's about speed and power largely today. So I think a lot of what we're talking about is like things do change over time. Styles change. Judo used to be the gentle way. Now it's the pawa furudo way. But when I came back to a martial art in my retirement, I said, I like a lot of stuff. I'm going to focus my practice on the jujitsu, which I often describe for people, laypersons in the community, as 1/3 karate, 1/3 aikido, 1/3 judo type grappling. So we have everything. We sweep, we trip, we throw, we grapple, we strike, we arm lock, we joint lock, we control, we strangle. It's everything. And that's the beauty about jujitsu and I love focusing on every piece of the curriculum, every piece of it. Dave, I'm going to surrender the floor to you.
I agree with everything you just said, Ken. The interesting aspect that I went toward when you were talking about art and jitsu is the difference between jujitsu and jujutsu. For those who, and I don't need to go into that. Anybody wants to, they can look it up. But what I wanted to share is the frustration that I experience directly and indirectly with the difference between competitive sport self-defense or self-preservation versus the reality of studying for street. Giving someone a second chance is like giving them an extra bullet for their gun because they missed you the first time. Okay, so here's the deal. If I'm teaching sport, I'm teaching something that has rules, and I'm giving my opponent not just a second chance, but a third and a fourth chance, oftentimes. And I'll give you just a great example. Had a young lady came to my dojo. She was distractingly attractive, which made it difficult for me to maintain a lot of attention in the dojo at that time. She also wanted to compete. And she asked at the end of a class, could we do a class on triangles? I said, arm, leg, both. She said, both. So the next class we started out and I asked for volunteers and we learned arm triangles and leg triangles, several different ways to enter and set. And after everybody was duly impressed and learned them, I said, now I need another volunteer. And so I said, take what you just learned, put me in a triangle. And on their way to setting it, I just reached over and grabbed crotch. Okay. From there, it's a strike, out, done. And all the people like, okay, so we learned this technique, but there's an obvious glaring weakness if my focus is, oh good, I'm on the street and I'm going to put this person in a triangle and make them upset that I know how to do that. Might not be what you want to use on the street, might not want to be your primary goal. And that was the gist of why I gave the young lady what she asked for, but also included in the class that whenever I'm teaching the sport aspect or the competitive aspect, I want to teach the reality aspect as well. Same thing happens in teaching. The piano students that I teach, any limitations I have as a teacher become my students' limitations. And consequently, I have sought through the years, anytime I hear a style being played on the piano that I haven't done, I make it my business to learn it, to get comfortable with it, and become adept at it, because then I can relate that to my students. And the ones that are interested do it. The ones that aren't, don't. Fine. I'm not going to foist a style on you. But when I teach self-defense, I want that same thing. I don't want any of my limitations to become my students' limitations. Chris, I think earlier you used the word open and creative. That's the way we want to approach this. No second chances when you are dealing with life and death. It's not a game, it's survival. Get real.
Yeah, let me get in here for a second. And I'm going to say this across all martial arts. We can teach. I think the most important thing we teach is self-control. Because if we teach techniques legitimately, the ultimate goal of every technique is for the attacker to become sufficiently disabled that they cannot continue their attack. Now, if that means a judo throw, and you plant your attacker through the concrete sidewalk with a hip throw, or it's an Aikido technique, and you execute it and he happens to fall off the curb and get hit by a car. I mean, these are things, we have even on one hand, we're trying to teach effective self-defense systems, regardless of what the art is. We as sensei also have a responsibility to teach our students self-control. And because that's what prevents them from A, getting hurt, and B, I'm not saying you ever intentionally hurt another person, because that violates every philosophy of the martial arts. You never intentionally, but if someone attacks you and they get hurt, that's what happens. It's not good or bad, it happens. Could you have prevented that injury if you had sufficient control of the technique? Perhaps yes, depending on the situation. All these other things come into play that you actually have very little control over. But the point is, as I think all of us has said, it's not necessarily what you teach, but how you teach it and what you include in your teaching. And that's what's important. It is because there's a more, when you're teaching someone how to break an arm, leg, neck, whatever you want to call it, you also have a moral responsibility to say, is there a way to avoid this type of injury to this person? And to me, that was one of the reasons I got into jiu-jitsu, because there's such a variety of techniques you could use that you could almost suit your technique. Once you become sufficiently proficient, you could almost adjust your technique to the situation so that if the person's drunk and they swing at you, you don't have to place them through the concrete. You can take the wrist, turn it, block it out of the way, go wrist lock takedown, take them down easily, or even into an arm lock. They still may not be cooperative with you that much, but you haven't really injured them. So part of our responsibility, and I think this is very common in jiu-jitsu, and like I said, most traditional martial arts, is you have a responsibility to control what you're doing. You have a responsibility to your attacker. And that's a hard thing to teach. And I've lost a few students because they would not accept that concept. That's conversely with, you're sending a submission and you tell the person, well, if you know the hold is set or it's starting to hurt, what's the magic word?
Mate.
Mate. Or you click your fingers or tap them on the head or, do something. And admittedly, I've had a few students that are really loosely jointed and they just look at their attacker and smile. But that's an exception to the rule. And some students will not recognize the mate. And some students won't use it because it isn't hurting that much to them until something gets broken or injured. And I basically tell my students, if you start feeling pain, feeling uncomfortable is one thing, but if you start feeling pain, that means damage has already been done to your body. And if this person were to pursue that submission or whatever they're doing further, it would result ultimately in a disabling injury. That's why you say mate. And it also lets the person doing the technique know that they are doing it right, because ultimately, as I also tell students, I could show you all this stuff. I could speak to you till hell freezes over, but ultimately you learn techniques it same applies in any martial art. You learn the effectiveness of a technique by feel. Not by sight, not by what your attacker is saying, but by feel. And to me, those are things that, that Seki stressed that I really felt were unique to the art, because he explained, the use of good judgment and how to use good judgment.
Yeah.
And that's critical.
Sensei, on one hand, I get exactly what you're saying, and we do have a responsibility, even when someone attacks us, to minimize the amount of injury that we impart. There's a flip side. Anybody know what a jump scare is in a movie?
No.
It's when the aggressor suddenly rises up when you thought they were totally debilitated. And an example is a professional soccer player who was ripped and cut, and somebody picked a fight with him and started to throw punches. And the soccer player came forward and forearm to the face and tripped him and slammed him to the ground. Stood back like, I'm done. And the guy on the ground reached in, pulled out a gun, and pumped 5 bullets into the soccer player and killed him. So the soccer player stopped because he figured he had done enough injury and put the guy on the ground, but then stopped. So even though we need to modulate, we also need to make sure that we either can run faster and get away, or if this person's packing, do we need to continue and make sure that we're still safe after we think we have perhaps maybe been effective enough? And that's a tough place in the heat of combat. That's a tough place to find ourselves. Sometimes it's blatantly obvious. They're unconscious.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it really is. I mean, if a person has a concealed weapon, handgun, unless you're going to take the time on the street after you've submitted them or have them in a submission hold where you're going to do a quick pat down, you're not going to see that coming. What Seki would do, he would never have us run away from a person. His attitude was, if it's on the street, you do your technique, whatever it is necessary to disable them. You don't stop with the wrist press. You press it till you break the wrist. That's street. And then you back up into what he said, Tachiwaza, a ready position, a few feet back where you have room to do something, or you can see this person. Just because you quote unquote submit the person doesn't mean you're done with them. And that's what some students believe. You get them to tap out, they say, I won't do anything. You never assume, because you know what the word assume spells.
Yes.
And so if you're going to, if you've just restrained a person and they're down on the ground, I've had students come back up, or people come back up and try for an attack the second time. And usually the fact that I'm now in a ready position is staying there open hand and say, you don't want to do this, or I don't want to do this. Sometimes a verbal command will work, but you never assume anything is over until you are in a safe position. And just because you've attacked this person, maybe broke their wrist or their arm, and if they're on drugs, they may not feel it. You step away, you have to be ready. And that's something, I've seen some martial arts dojos where the person sets a submission and then they get up and the defender or whatever, and they turn around and walk away. My first question is, how high on the stupid list are you? You never turn your back on a threatening situation. But that's part of learning the art of self-defense. And that's a hard, if you get attacked from behind after you've taken a person down, that's a hard lesson to learn, but you're going to learn it, unfortunately. So, we can teach all the techniques we want, but as Chris has said, and Ken and Dave has said, part of effectiveness in any martial art is being aware of what's going on around you. Even your attacker, even if you think you've taken care of him and you're quote unquote safe, you never assume that. You cannot assume that. And I made that mistake once with a kid that was high on drugs at the I was at, and ultimately, fortunately, his mistake was you can't kick with both feet and hit with both hands at the same time. And what made it felony assault was that his fist touched my eyeglasses and knocked them off. But then he was down on the ground and it was easy to take care of him. And fortunately, 2 Metro police walked into the counseling office and they handcuffed and foot cuffed him and put him in a closet until a black and white could show up, patrol car, and take him off to where he had to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I at the kid's trial, I felt sorry for him because he had a crummy defense attorney, and kid was convicted. There's no question there, but it's just, but anyway, you cannot, if you're part of jujitsu, I think, because it's oriented around self-defense, or should be, is that part of that teaching has to include an awareness that you're not safe until you and the attacker are secured. And then
The flip side, Sensei, is a couple of 17-year-old provisional black belts who spoke, saying that before they studied jujitsu and before they studied karate, this is back in my karate days, they got in a lot of fights in school. And now that they've come up through the ranks in karate, they realize how surprised they were that they weren't getting in fights. Well, they realized they had developed self-control, and they realized how ridiculous it was that they were fighting over. And so what they got out of karate was peace through détente. We don't need to do this. That's not proving anything.
I think I've even had some kids read Sun Tzu, The Art of War, and even some teachers, and they say, why should I read that? And I said, the main concept is you don't have to fight every battle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But see, all that is part of the philosophy, right? It's really got nothing to do with
Any martial
art itself.
Right.
They could have been training at Cobra Kai and had a different outcome. That's the funny part about the whole Karate Kid series, right? Is it's the same. It's still karate, but it's two different philosophies. That have benefits and negatives, at the same time, and that's what it comes down to. And over time, it's the more peaceful philosophy becomes Miyagi-Do karate, and the strike first, strike hard, becomes a Cobra Kai, or whatever he ended up calling it at the end, Eagle Fang or some ridiculous. I don't know if you guys have watched the series, but it's pretty funny.
Interesting. The interesting thing about each of you gentlemen have mentioned something interesting. Chris, like what you're referring to there is humility versus arrogance, right? To be humble in the martial art. But I wanted to go back a little bit. George, a moment ago, you mentioned awareness. Actually, Dave may have said awareness. Anyway, the word awareness came up. George, you were talking about good judgment and control and awareness. And in our classes, part of our basic principles, right up there with Kazushi and Sabaki, are the principles of Mushin, clear mind, Budoshin, emotional balance, Zanshin, situational awareness, and I always add to that Kokyu Ho, easy breathing or regulated breathing, controlled breathing. I always teach those pieces because, one, if you're sparring, you'll become breathless very fast if you're not in control and not regulating your breathing. But two, in a real life situation, do your quick check-in there. Do your check-in, and especially your breathing. Keep that diaphragm breathing, keep the air moving, and stay relaxed and stay calm. To use a recent example, just last month, when going to my acupuncturist, there were some persons with addictions issues in the doorway of the business establishment with their bags and all their stuff and all their drug paraphernalia spread out. And I had to get past them, but they did not like me suggesting that they move their things out of the doorway. It was actually a health clinic, so it's kind of important to move their things out of the doorway. So I politely, respectfully, and humbly asked them to move their stuff and offered to help them move their stuff. One gentleman eventually did move, but the second young man did not want to move. In fact, he thought he'd rather fight me, put me in my place. And he called me fat. He was body shaming. But anyway, I just remained calm. I didn't engage. It would have been just too easy to in any way knock this guy over. But eventually, in a moment or two, they just moved their stuff out of the way and they just moved on. My martial arts training benefited me in that situation because I kept my ego under control. I didn't even have to fight the impulse to strike this guy or grab this guy or other. I just stood back a safe distance and was present in the moment. And to use the term that came up, we talked about awareness. I was just aware and in control, but I had a reasonable expectation to access the building to get through the door, and just remained calm. And I would say there we win 100% of the fights that we don't have. So
Yes.
that was Wayne Gretzky said, we miss 100% of the shots we don't take. Well, I'll say, we win 100% of the fights that we don't engage in. But anyway, my points there were the Mushin, Budoshin, Zanshin, Kokyu, Ho, easy breathing, stay calm, stay present, and realize, are you fighting, fight your own ego. If you have to fight a battle, fight your own ego and really just don't complicate things. And that's why I also teach that in our personal safety program, which we call de-escalation with communication. We teach really how to de-escalate situations with verbal and nonverbal communication. Use our body language, don't escalate it. And so this young man who really, really wanted to act out, I didn't engage with him. So I considered it a big win. And I call that martial arts training.
Yeah. I think, one thing I've done I've seen my students do it too, and to reinforce what you said, calmness in a street situation is your key to not having to physically engage. And I don't know who I learned this from. It was not my sensei. It may have been from another teacher or maybe even a police officer. I think a police officer actually was a student of mine. We got into some interesting situations, even with real police. But if he was in what do you call a tight situation, yes, he'd control his breathing, he'd step back, he'd speak in a calm, steady voice, being officially polite, always using sir, please, all these things that were on the one hand, you could tell that if you wanted to screw around, he was not going to screw around with you. But his manner, his body language, and his manner of speaking were such that the message he was getting across in some cases was, you don't want to mess with me. In other cases, it was, we can resolve this without resorting to any kind of physical force or me having to do anything. Okay. And he was very good at it. Funny is we were training, we were training in a local park one day on a Sunday against knife attacks. And we tended to use, and I still have it, we use a real knife with the blade is obviously completely dulled down. You could not cut anything or maybe you could straight stab, but you couldn't cut anything if your life depended on it. And we were practicing. Apparently someone thought we were in a real street situation and they called the police. And next thing we notice is there are two police cars moving up from either side in the park itself. Both doors are open. And so, him and I both knew what was happening. And we simply stopped. He reached into his backpack and pulled out his badge. And that de-escalated the whole situation right there. And then we had an interesting talk. But anyway, it's many times a physical confrontation can be avoided simply how you handle yourself. Because as Ron or Ken said, if you can be calm, if you can keep your calm, you can de-escalate a situation many times. And that's a key ingredient to effective self-defense, is not having to use it. And I mean, that's one of the things, I appreciate from Seki and some of the other experiences I've had, is that, you learn things from other people that really can ultimately save your butt. Because ultimately that's what you're interested in. I'm sorry to use that term, but if you can avoid fighting that battle, you've won.
Another phrase you can use in a situation like that is, we don't have to be like this. My name's Dave. Hold my hand up.
Yeah, that's another way. I mean, there are a lot of things you can do to de-escalate a situation.
If you smile, that can be misinterpreted though. If you're calm and you smile, that could be you're being pleasant, but it could also be a don't mess with me smile or a challenging smile. Smile
right.
can be double entendre. So even though you might feel like I can diffuse this by appearing pleasant, that can backfire.
You don't have to smile, but you have to sound convincing to them, not to yourself. It's convincing to them. It's almost like you don't smile at a person and say, "Make my day."
Yeah, but no, Dave, that's a good point, and we spend a lot of time as well focusing on that in your personal space or close to the personal space communication, like how. And for us, we emphasize neutrality, practicing how to be neutral without being patronizing or condescending or cynical or sarcastic, but being authentic. Like, I know, genuine and authentically, genuinely. Don't seek to engage in a physical altercation, but be prepared.
Our son Logan is 6'4" and about 240 pounds. And he's a gentle giant and very polite. And I get a kick out of it because he's just never had any of the situations that his dad, who's only 5'11", has found himself in through the years. It's like, okay, Logan, lucky for you, buddy. You had an uncle who was 7 feet tall.
Anyway, I think at this point, I think we've digressed a bit from the original topic, but maybe we haven't. Just been.
The conversation has been great. I've for me, it's been on target. I very much appreciate it.
This is a good one. We kind of diverted a little bit, but we kept whatever we diverted to, we kept to the theme, and that I was not anticipating spending the entire hour and a half on traditional jiu-jitsu, and we evolved from that to some other subtopics, but it's all there.
But jiu-jitsu strategy, like in judo, we always taught if your opponent comes out hard, fight soft. If he wants to lock in, stay out.
Yeah.
Don't play game. And in jiu-jitsu, I always teach if you encounter a guy in the street, if he's a striker, well, then don't box a boxer and don't grapple a grappler. You go to whatever else they appear to not be comfortable in. So that's what we're doing. You have a script, we're going off script.
It's as one of Seki's key words was, you never fight your attacker. You always help them. And part of that philosophy is the reason you help them is because they are sick. Because if they were not sick, they would not be attacking you. So you help your attacker. And that's a mindset I've adopted because it works for me. And it's some people can't do that. If I have to defend myself, I'm fighting. No, you're not. You can fight or you can help.
Yeah.
Because in Aikido, you help the person go where they want to go. In judo, ultimately, you help the person go where they want to go.
Yeah.
In karate, you encourage the person to go the way you want them to go.
That's a good point, though. Like if we come into somebody, like when I come into contact with a person with addictions issues, and they're due for their therapy, let's say, and they're trying to prepare a fix. But it's what you say there, George, is very profound. Like if we encounter somebody who's acting out and they're acting out of control, why would we escalate to that same level of out of control, of mindlessness? Like that is contrary to our humble approach to martial art.
Yeah.
Rather than, we don't want to feed our ego and say, oh, I can take this guy down so easy. We don't feed the ego in that circumstance.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Never underestimate. Never underestimate.
No.
Yeah, exactly. And never be assuming and never underestimate. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, one
of the things that happens in class is it allows you and your students to catastrophize, to look at the situations and say, okay, let's look at worst case scenarios for this, worst case scenarios for this, and learn from exaggerating.
Yeah. Okay. I think at this point we're going to have to draw things to a close today. We covered one topic and kind of meandered into another, which is non-physical self-defense, for lack of a better phrase. And
Sensei, I'd like to thank you for not calling on Chris any more often than you did, because no more than he contributed. I have 2 pages of notes from what he said, and I did get writer's cramp, Chris.
no, it's
Well, I'm glad I was able to join. It was kind of a rare opportunity for me. So
it was good. It was
Good
good
seeing
having you
everyone.
back, Chris. And I love your dojo. I think it was nice of the city to remodel the room for you.
come by and visit.
I sent Chris a LinkedIn request, Chris. So if you ever log in the LinkedIn,
Okay.
you'll see a connect request there.
Sure.
Okay.
And you're in Canada, correct?
I am in the Greater Vancouver area of Canada. Yeah.
Okay, I remember that about you. I thought it was a little further east than Vancouver.
Well, Ontario for a couple of meetings, and I was in Montreal at Judo Canada for one meeting, but I'm in Newfoundland.
Uh-huh.
And here's a little more Canadiana for you. There's my Mountie mug, Royal Canadian Mounted Police mug, which I'm having my coffee in today. So there's a little Canadiana for you.
There you go. Eh?
So if you give Ken trouble, he's going to give you a Canadian mugging.
He's
Anyway,
going to call me a Yankee pretty soon.
It's always a pleasure to meet with you, gentlemen. I always learn something new. It's great.
Likewise, Ken, we appreciate you.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend and a great Christmas holidays. Question: do we want to have the next meeting on January 3rd or the following week? I don't know if some people make New Year's Eve a 3-day event.
If you do.
New Year's Eve.
You're doing something wrong.
I'll leave that up to you guys. I'm gonna go run teach, but Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.
Yes.
Take care.
We'll figure it out.
Either one works. Thank you.
Take care.
George, yeah, I'm good either way, George. I don't necessarily extend the New Year's Eve thing. And my apologies for today. I had a cold last week with fever and chills the past 2 days. So this morning I was a little slow on the upstart, but I managed to get connected eventually.
You're okay. We had a good time. That's what counts.
All right, that's good.
Okay.
All right.
Take
See
care.
you next year.
Absolutely, next year.
Okay.